Good evening. I hope I can be heard. And on that assumption, I will continue to speak. I must thank Abhinaya Bharati for giving me this opportunity to speak on a subject that is extremely complicated. And I took up the challenge so as to refresh my understanding of Russia, its politics, the kind of social movements, engineering, socio-political evolution, and the complexity of the society. Of course, all this in the background of theatre. The title, as you have seen, is Russian theatre. It's a very presumptuous, very large, huge canvas. Of course, I have had prepared a presentation to go with this. Unfortunately, due to technical. Hello, Jyoti. Yes.
Sir, namaste. ಈಗ ನಾನು ಅದು ತೆಗೆಯೋಕೆ ಹೋಗ್ಲೇ ಇಲ್ಲ ಸರ್. ನಾನು ಟ್ರೈ ಮಾಡಿದೆ. ಈಗ ನಾನು ಏನ್ ಮಾಡಿನ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ನಾನು ಸ್ಕ್ರೀನ್ ಶಾಟ್ ತೆಗೆದು ಅದರದೆಲ್ಲ ಪಿಕ್ಚರ್ಸ್ ಹಾಕ್ಬಿಟ್ಟಿಲ್ಲ ನಮ್ಮ ಗ್ರೂಪ್ಗೆ.
Okay, I am already live. Is it okay?
Okay. ನಾನು ಅಪ್ರೂವ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೇನೆ.
Okay, ಮಾಡಿ. Okay, I have not yet. Okay, please approve. Yes. This is like staring into empty space. I see no one, and I am not even sure that I am actually online being heard on the other side. Okay, just imagine an actor being on stage and not being able to see anyone, and imagining what kind of emotions, what kind of expressions people are having within them and expressing on their faces. But anyway, I will go along with this whole new situation, and we have to play the game, as it were. So let me continue in the hope that I'm online and being seen and heard. Just to quickly recap, the title is very ambitious, Russian theatre. Obviously, I do not have the hubris of saying that I will be covering the entire history as well as some of the highlights of the Russian theatre. But I have tried to get a kind of panoramic view of the history, and the history in terms of the actual political, social history of Russia, and brought in high points of the development of theatre as, like milestones in this. I mean, they cannot be separated because Russian theatre has played a very important role in the kind of mindset that came to be developed over a period of time, and it has also been used instrumentally right from the beginning by Peter the Great, who wanted to introduce westernization. So he brought in foreign actors, he trained Russian actors, and he actually built a theater in the Red Square. He called it Komedzinaya Khramina, which means it's a kind of Khramina is a building, is a place where people meet. And comedy, of course, he was referring to entertainment. And So that was, I mean, start right from the beginning, which is a late 16th, the late 17th and early 16th, early 18th century. So let me get into this subject right away. Now, I'm sorry I'm not able to show you the slides, but Jyoti Dikshit of Vinaya Bharati says that she has put up some of the material that I shared with her on the wall of Vinaya Bharati. So those of you who have access to it, please take a look. That might be supplementary, another mode of, you can supplement. My lecture today can be supplemented with those slides, and I hope you are able to gain more from taking a look at both. Very brief introduction. I am co-founder of Osage, which is a theatre arts as well as performing arts initiative. We have been around since 2014, and we have been active in theatre. And I also am an adjunct faculty at the National School of Drama in Bangalore, the Bangalore chapter. And I have taken voice and speech as my special area of special discipline. Now, coming back to Russian theatre, this webinar, let me say first what it is about and then what it is not about. So this is a run-through of Russian history. Russia became Soviet Union or USSR, and then it's back to Russia once again after early 1990s. Then the emergence of progressive ideas in this land, socio-political, philosophical, scientific. You'll see that theatre and science and philosophy have gone together. It's a very interesting mix of these different kinds of intellectual activities. Then there will be some theory. Of course, you have acting and psychology, some acting and audience-related reflections, interactive theatre. And what this webinar is not, it does not discuss particularities. There are no biographies. I mean, I'm not going to getting deep into any biographical material. Not a critical appreciation of genres. There have been many vaudeville and various other kinds of things that then realistic theatre, then later on Brechtian. So I'm not really getting deep into any of these genres, but as and when we come to those highlights, we will try and go deeper to the extent possible, and of course, as far as time permits. And again, what it is not is that it is not, unfortunately, going to be talking about the great writers. Although Turgenev comes in a brief mention as we go along, then of course there is Ostrovsky, who was a well-known writer of plays, like playwright, and realistic plays, as well as talking about Russian character, Russian soul, Russian people. We will not be talking about these things in any great detail. And so this will only be a passing synopsis. And what it is again is that it is going to be a fleeting account of one of the greatest societal engineering experiments of all time. And what worked and what seems not to have worked. We'll try and reflect on that as well. Now, it's all in the name of the people. When the Tsar says that he is a representative of God, so between Orthodox Church and the nationality, the Russian nationality, which is an abstract thing, it's not the people. People will continue to suffer, but you have a nationality as an object here, an abstract object, and the Orthodox Church, the God on this other hand, and in between Peter says that I am going to balance these two as a represent. I mean, not necessarily Peter, because Peter looked towards the west and he modernized, he brought in scientific, technology, and he modernized the navy. But later Tsars, especially Nicholas, who we shall come to slowly in course of time. So what is important is that everything is claimed on behalf of the Russian people, the Russian dusha, as it is called, the Russian soul. Okay. Now, the earliest mention of theater, this is called skomarokhi. Basically, a skomarokhi is a kind of entertainer, a clown, a person, a group of people who play instruments, who sing, who crack jokes, often very bawdy jokes. And these are basically performers, entertainers. So they entertained individual, nobles, or they entertained large, people higher up in the social hierarchy of the times. So in fact, 10th century is the earliest when there's a record of skomarokhi. They entertain villagers with songs, jokes, buffoonery, animal tricks, puppet shows. It's like we have this dombarata anta heltevalla. So that kind of, and the dombarata, dom is actually not limited to any particular geography, even in India. You have mention of the domes even in North India, in Himachal Pradesh. In fact, interestingly, there was an Indologist called Ivan Pavlovich Minaev who traveled and who recorded a lot of these things, and how the dombas were used as to propagate kind of resistance to the British of those times, late 19th century, early 20th century. So all this is a very interesting record. Now, moving on, we have the Orthodox Church, which condemns and says that these skomarokhi are pagans and they are anti-religious, anti-God. They take you away from doing good things within quotes, and of course they are banned. They are repressed by the ruling elite, and they are banned. But of course they are proscribed. But their effects continue. Their traditions continue in different forms. In fact, although they are not called skomarokhi, it is like the vaudeville, the theater, the entertaining, fun kind of theater, multiple kinds of entertainment that comes in, with the French coming in when they invited by both Peter as well as Catherine, who comes later after Peter the Great. Now, the first Tsar that we are talking about is Tsar Alexei. He made drama part of court life. Then Peter the Great imports actors, I had mentioned earlier. He trains young Russians. Then what is the greatest contribution of Peter the Great? That he wanted to see the Russians, especially the nobility. We're not yet talking about the serfs, the ordinary peasants, poor people. We are not yet talking about. Most of this history, unfortunately, talks about the nobility, people close, who had landed people, then who were supporting the king or the emperor through collecting taxes from the serfs, and so we are talking mainly about this. So Peter the Great got them trained in Western manners, and it's very interesting from the Western, the Russian dress, the kind of free-flowing, kind of upper dress, and then you have this loose trousers. He got them to wear Western, like typically both British and French kind of dress, costume. And then he got them to shave their beards, and there was even something called a beard tax. So if you had paid a beard tax, then you can have a beard, you can sport a beard. so there was beard tax as well. And then, of course, following Peter the Great, we have Catherine, who was extremely progressive in her own ways. She was, she's called Catherine the Great because she brought in a lot of reforms. Then she brought in liberal education. She was a German, I think, German by birth, and she came to the throne by through a coup against her own husband. I mean, those details we'll not be interested in. But she brought in liberal education. She brought in women's education, creating special schools for them, and then revolutionary ideas borrowed from the French Revolution. She was one of those who talked of equality. Some things like you'll be surprised by the kind of progressive. She said all citizens should be equal before the law. Torture should be banned. Liberty was her central theme. But of course, as in the initial period, she was very, very progressive. But later on, when things happened that threatened the throne, she began to water down her, liberalizing moves, if you might want to call it. Especially there was a revolt by Cossacks, and there was a man called Pugachev who was leading the Cossacks, and then he himself claimed to be a Tsar, and then of course he was hanged, executed. And what happens later on, of course it's also important that we remember she talks of the same values of enlightenment, post-Renaissance, equality, liberty, fraternity, the idea that everybody shall live and work for attaining the good of all. I mean, these were some values, abstract values, but even to have thought about them is very, very interesting. And separation of religion from state, this of course is a French value. This was not so much, but we do not hear much about her, being very religious. We do not have much of anything to suggest that she was very religious. Now, Catherine, of course, makes a turnabout as I said, is this whole Cossack revolt. And then what happened to Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, who were guillotined, and she saw that as a result. I mean, she had read Voltaire, and for a woman to be educated, well-read at that, about 300 years or 250 years ago, is very, very significant. And she's thought that by by opening up the society to liberal thinking, it might pose a threat to the monarchy itself. And then she watered down her entire liberalization program. Now, of course, as I said, that because of the influence of the French, a lot of French people were invited. You had the vaudeville, you had French drama, and of course you had Russian melodrama and French melodrama. And melodrama, as all of us, all artists, all theatre people know, melos actually comes from the Greek root of music, and drama is something which is dramatic, where tend to the plot appeals to emotion, sentiment, employs very bombastic dialogues, and relatively low in action, as well as not being really focused on the ideas that. So it's basically looking at action, emotion. I mean, not action, emotion, sentimentality, relationships, but not necessarily locating it in the larger context of the evolution of society. So typically melodrama is a kind of family drama, a drama within, among few individuals, but not necessarily deep enough, doesn't go into the psychology, doesn't go into necessarily into the motivation for why people do it. And vaudeville, of course, you have a theatrical genre, which has given a completely new life in the US much later in the 19th and 20th century. variety entertainment, which was born in France, comedy without psychological or moral intentions, assortment of entertainments, juggling, slapstick, words and actions that are designed for laughter. I mean, if you look at it that way, the Skamaroki that we talked about earlier and the vaudeville, there's not much of a difference between the two. But of course, vaudeville took birth in France and the Skamaroki were in Russia. In the late 19th century, you have the drama written by Ivan Turgenev. Ivan Turgenev is an extremely wonderful writer, and even on an individual level, as his mother, he's the son of a large, landowning nobility. Mother, he finds his mother extremely, cruel to her serfs. 20,000 serfs is something that kind of his family owned, and he actually pursues the liberation of serfs. So in the 1850s, a major campaign he writes and promotes it in various journals, the idea of giving the serfs complete freedom. And then we have other, writers, Nikolai Gogol, Alexander Griboyedov, then Ostrovsky. I mean, I will just talk about a couple of them. See, for example, Ostrovsky, Alexander Nikolaevich Ostrovsky, the playwright, generally considered the greatest representative of the Russian realistic period. We'll talk about realism later a little bit. I'm using realism in a way, like as life is seen. Okay, realism has other connotations. We'll look at them later on. He wrote 47 original plays, among the most widely read and performed in Russia. One of them, for example, Poverty is No Vice. He talks about the old Russian, he is actually looking at Russia as made up of people, the old Russian people, the soul of the Russian, the kind of traditions people have and how they relate. And this is ordinary, common people, the peasants, and the serfs. He's actually talking about them. And this is around the 1850s when you have a lot of those who are well-read, educated, the intelligentsia, they're called intelligentsia, intelligenti. So who are they promote what they call, these are Slavophiles. They promote the values of Russia, of the Slavic people. Of course, this was also in other Slavic lands like Poland and Czechoslovakia, Serbia, and others. Now, and the westernizers. I mean, we have seen a tradition of westernizing from Peter the Great and then Catherine, and it continues. Of course, then we suddenly come to the early 1800s when Napoleon invades Russia, and then Alexander I, of course, has to mobilize an army and create to mythify the people, mythify an idea of Russia. Without that, to get people to support the war would be very difficult. And so a lot of the theatre people are involved in this mythification of Russia, the Russian soul. We have seen it across the world, and we talk of a particular soul and then use that to mobilize people for good, for worse. Okay, so poverty is no wise. It reproduces the atmosphere of old Russian carnival. There's something called Svyatki, which is it is some kind of a church festival, like a Yuletide, observances, some church rituals, observances of the old Russian people, highlighted the conflict between Slavophiles and Westernizers. So Ostrovsky was actually talking about the kind of tensions that existed between the two. And he was very well received in the mid-19th century. And of course, Slavophilia was an intellectual movement originating from the 19th century that wanted Russian Empire to be developed upon values and institutions derived from its early history. Slavophils opposed the influences of Western Europe in Russia. Western Europe, you've seen how Western Europe also got identified with with Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and Alexander, of course, has to decide on. Of course, although the influences in theatre of French continues, but the material, the kind of plots, the kind of heroes are those who protect Russia, or those who found Moscow, Muscovy, or those who fight and drive away enemies. So you have national heroes coming up in this particular period. Now, of course, Ostrovsky had developed a different approach to his art. Wouldn't it be more intriguing to try and get under the skin? For example, he's talking about the kind of bribery, corruption that is already beginning to happen because of the hierarchy that exists, and how the bribe-taking affects common people. Wouldn't it be more intriguing to try and get under the skin of the bribe-taking corrupt people, learn how their special kind of morality works, expose the logic which helps them find excuses for themselves? So he's actually trying to say, what is this corruption about? When we talk of corruption, what does it mean? Is it some XYZ, or is that under the skin where everyone who is involved in that bribe-taking and corruption has to be investigated? So he's actually beginning to look at the inner workings of the psychology of the people and why people all support corruption. Now, Moscow actors, of course, were very critical because he used certain kinds of language and the settings, for example, taverns, which were, see, the Moscow actors, of course, they were all from the nobility to start with, and then there were serfs like, almost like bonded slaves. It's interesting because, just as an aside, 1851, when Uncle Tom's Cabin was written, it is in the United States, against slavery, and you have a similar kind of thing against serfdom in 1851 by Turgenev. That's something I must mention. So this is the kind of situation where he's talking about, what the Moscow actors say, who come mainly from the nobility, although serfs, as I said, were also trained to be, so they were trained, they were given instruction in languages, and they were sort of groomed. You have this finishing school, so they were subject to the processes of a finishing school. They would so that they fit very well into the in the kind of social milieu which was visited by all the nobility. So you have Moscow actors. They were critical of his the kind of language and setting used. So I'll give you a kind of quotation from one of these actors. What kind of characters, what sort of language? Only in kabaks, these are taverns, where people drink and then use foul language, and indecent houses do people speak and act this way. This is theatre, after all, not some marketplace show or a backyard where one is free to spill garbage out. Okay, so this is the kind. So therefore, there were people who were critical of Tarkovsky. Not Tarkovsky. I'm sorry, that's Ostrovsky. Although, of course, the ski tends to sort of pull you in by the cadence of that sound. Now, at the turn of the 20th century, 19th century, you have people, authors like Chekhov, Gorky, Ibsen being performed. Yes, I'm talking of the theatre, where Chekhov, of course, he was brought in largely by Konstantin Stanislavski, and he was writing for Stanislavski. Nemirovich, Danchenko, and Stanislavski together founded the Moscow Art Theatre, and where you had a realistic place. And who are the kinds of audiences for these theatre performances? They were nobles, officials, military officers, merchants. It's interesting because we will be talking about Stanislavski. Stanislavski's, lineage it comes from merchant lineage. Initially, of course, the first Peter, also Peter, in the early part of 18th century was a serf, and in Petrograd, in Leningrad later on, and St. Petersburg, and he made his way by selling products, produce from the farms and various other things to the the gentry of St. Petersburg, and then he subsequently came down. The descendants came to Moscow and established. Stanislavski's father was the owner. I mean, Stanislavski himself was part of a family which owned gold and silver thread manufacturing units. And Stanislavski is not his name. He was Alexei. This is the family. The company was Alexeyev company. Rogoshsky, Alexeyev, Rogoshsky. These were very rich people, and in fact, Dostoevsky in some of his works mentions Rogozhin. Rogozhin, from this kind of background. You have people who are extremely rich, but the Rogozhin character in Dostoevsky is not very sophisticated. He's a recruit. He wants to buy up, in all his whatever he wants to. He wants to buy Nastasia Filippova, the idiot. But here, of course, Stanislavski is an extremely sophisticated, although from merchant classes, which are not necessarily known for their intellectual sophistication by Stanislavski. We'll be talking about it very, very quickly. Now, what happens in this 1812 period, that is still Alexander I? You have the Russo-French War. Napoleon invades Moscow and is defeated, and there is this war that creates a need for public signifiers. As I already said, that Russia needed to be united through one myth, Russian soul, Russian people, and so theater was very important. What happens was, you have the nobility, and if they feel compelled to give all their best to the war, their serfs, because like I said, they own hundreds and thousands of serfs, and serfs are actually recruited, conscripted. They're not recruited, they are conscripted, which means they have to fight the war. They have no choice. But then they must feel that they are fighting for their own people, for their own land. In fact, there are moments in the theater of Russia where the characters exalt, Russian peasantry. They exalt Russian peasantry, saying that these are soldiers who fight for the fatherland. Okay? Russia was called not Rodina. Rodina is motherland. Now it is Otechество. Otechество is the fatherland. So they fight for the fatherland, whereas the other soldiers, the soldiers of the opposing power, they are mercenaries. So that's how, I will come to that presently. Now in 1814, what happens is, when these officers, that Alexander II won the war, he pushed Napoleon back, and Prussians entered. Alexander rode a horse into Champs-Élysées in Paris, and they lived there, the officers, and they were there for about, the soldiers, for about a year, maybe several months ago. And so you have this word called bistro. It's used where it's a sidewalk cafe where people. So the word bistro comes from is believed to come from the word bistra, which is quickly, fast food. So bistra means quick. So obviously these soldiers must have been very hungry, and they said, okay, bistra, dawai bistra means give me food quickly. So bistro comes from there. Just as an aside, I thought that will be interesting for you to remember. Okay, now so these officers, they came back and they saw that in Paris, in France, although Napoleon, of course, was a kind of ambitious soldier who became, who considered himself the emperor of Europe. Now, what is happening is France itself, because of the kind of influences of the thought that was taking place among the people in general, not only among the elite, not only among the educated, everyone. So there was a certain degree, the kind of equality. There was no, there was a hierarchy, but because this was post-revolution, 1787, 86, the French Revolution, then so 1791, around that period. So you have the French Revolution, and then of course you have had terrible events that take place there. But what is happening here is that they have seen that there is a certain kind of equality, and people from all walks of life, they are sharing, and it's not the kind of oppressive hierarchy that exists in because of the in Russia, because of the serfdom, because of the peasantry not being, serfs were bonded to their land. They were actually chattels. They were owned by the landlords. So you could sell and buy serfs. So there were bodies to be sold. So you can imagine what kind of lives they must. They can't leave their, wherever they are, their silo, the kind of settlement they were in. So it's very, very similar to the slaves and to the kind of bonded labor that we have had. This, but of course, the peasantry, serfs are, they could be. They could be traded, they could be trained, as I said, they could be trained to become actors. But at the same time, a serf and a peasant was someone who had no land, but he worked the land of other people and received something in return for his keep, for his life. Okay, so these people, the officers, the nobility, they came back, especially the elite guards, Preobrazhensky and various other guards, they came back and they said, let us now demand the similar kind of reforms in Russia. Now what happens is, in the December of 1825, Alexander I dies. And they see a vacuum because Nicholas the son was not necessarily ready to become a king, an emperor at the time. So this is a revolt, large number of officers. Of course, it is put down and many of them hanged, and these are called Decembrists. And the seeds of a new revolution, this series of revolutions that take place in Russia are sown in this particular moment. They are called Decembrists, Dekabrists, in Russian. And of course this revolt is very, very viciously put down. Now so the Decembrists movement was intended to bring down the autocracy and establish constitutional monarchy. And many Decembrists are passionate about literature, artistic and cultural life of the nation. So you have the beginnings of a lot of literary movement, lot of writing, a lot of theater that supports a different kind of Russia. So this is when the formation of an intelligentsia begins to take place at this juncture. So the warriors are very important, because what happens is theaters in Moscow and St. Petersburg, they take an active role in national myth making. Now they have idealized representations of simple Russian people. Now they are bringing it, because when these officers and soldiers who have been derived from serfs, they fight, battle one after another against Napoleon, they see that noble people, they will have nobility of character. So this is when they believe that they form a social setup is very important. And the Decembrists first revolt against these kind of. So what happens is, Russian soldier who dies on the battlefield for the fatherland, which I mentioned earlier, whereas the soldier who fights against the Russian soldier, for example, a French soldier, a Napoleonic soldier, he is a mercenary. That's what he calls me. He's not fighting for. He's fighting for a ruble, for $1, whereas a Russian soldier is fighting for his fatherland. See, this is a kind of myth making that took place in the theatre of that particular period. Now, of course, we have to remember that a peasant is, a peasant's work is characterized in the following words. Mark Twain is talking about a peasant. What kind of a peasant he has in mind, and what was the reality of the time. Do you understand our work? Who brings supplies to the city? Who supports the entire army? Who gives their song for service to the Tsar and their realm? Who by the sweat of their brow feeds, dresses and makes boots for the Tsar, the nobility, merchants and workmen? Who? The peasants, the tillers of the soil, the benefactors of the human race. It's very interesting. We have in our own land, we have, these are not peasants, these are farmers, partly peasants also. So this is something that whenever we look at the history of other places, we see that there is a parallel that runs across the world in several other countries, and today it happens to be in India. And also remember that something is happening in Russia today. As I said, Russia, Soviet Union, Russia. Today is already again Russia, and there's a ferment. People are on the streets. Here, farmers are on the streets. There is always a clamor, and you've seen the kind of, when the Tsar does not listen to his people, what happens? This is what happens in later history. We'll not really be talking about later history, but because the Tsars do not listen to the people, then therefore that leads to a complete change in the socio-political scene of Russia. Now moving on. So as I said, farmer has agricultural land which he cultivates and earns his livelihood by it. And the peasant normally does not have land for subsistence. He cultivates other farmers' lands to earn his livelihood. Now, when we come to Alexander the II, let's first discuss some of the. Although we have discussed Alexander first, that is in the beginning of 19th century, 1801, he becomes monarch, and he dies in 1825, as I mentioned earlier. So Alexander the First, what are the things he brings? What kind of reforms does he bring? He allows civil society to express private dissent. So people express their dissent with various things that may be going wrong, and he allows the publication of journals, novels, poetry, and theatrical criticism. Okay? And however, he begins to tighten the regime once the war is over. You see, what we have seen in Catherine and what we have seen in Alexander I is that when they meet people, they seem to sort of relax. When they feel that they're being threatened, their throne is being threatened, they begin to tighten the regime's iron fists. So this is what happened, and of course it provokes angry opposition among the returning officers. This is exactly what happened, what led to the Decembrist uprising. So this is about, so there was a relative openness. Now you have seen in the case of Catherine, openness and suddenly becoming closed. Alexander, openness, suddenly closing. See, so this is a kind of, it's not as though there is a continuous feedback based change on the part of the Tsars, so theater was serving an instrumental purpose. It served an instrumental purpose right from Peter's time to Alexander the First time. See, so that is what. So theatre is being used by the powers that are. Not, of course, it is also being, it is used to express the kind of problems that exist in society, in social life, the socio-political hierarchy, but at the same time, the greater use of theatre comes from the monarchical powers. Now, when we see, there is something called theatral. Theatral is a very, very Russian word. It means someone who is part of the theatre, but someone who is a part of the theatre who is erudite, who is having liberal views, who is well read, who is educated, and who has refined taste. So a theatral, say all these officers that came back, the kind of officers in the elite regiments of Tsar Alexander or any other Tsar. Now when they begin to see what is happening in France, and you've seen that Catherine was reading Voltaire, Diderot. So she was, but of course for her they were, as soon as her throne was threatened, they closed up. But here the officers said that this is the kind of society we must build, an open society which allows the expression as well as the learnings that we got when we were in Paris, in France or in other lands, wherever they were. And so that is something they want. So they begin to interact with people who are writing, and see, although they cannot become professional actors themselves, but they become critics. They begin to encourage other people to write. So you have officers who become, who attend theatre, they attend literary circles, and there is a salon. It's a kind of in Bangalore, for example, you have Koshis, or you have near Ravindra Kalakshetra, you have those little places. I don't know, you don't have them today, I suppose. But whenever after you finish a play, people go and gather. It's those who are interested in what took place. They discuss the play, they discuss the context of the play, and also perhaps new ideas. And sometimes people gather to read new plays. So these were this salon of Alexei Nikolaevich Alenin. This is a very famous salon in St. Petersburg. And so these officers would attend that, and you have new poetic and dramatic works being discussed, read. A new theatre impresario is invented. So he was an impresario. An impresario is an extremely refined, sophisticated. So an impresario has a broad view, is educated in a very large sense. And when it was usually he, not so many she's, unfortunately, this, although Catherine was instrumental, Catherine the Empress was instrumental in getting a lot of the young women educated, but she was, of course, not she was the exception rather than the rule. So you have the theatral, who are these people with refined tastes. Then, so this was a time when you have the entire from 1825 to 1850, 60s. This Turgenev was writing, Dostoevsky was writing. Then Pushkin, there was another Pushkin. Of course, Pushkin was very controversial subsequently. Pushkin was writing. Then you had other writers. You had, as I already mentioned, you have Turgenev and Ostrovsky, who were writing about all these the kind of society that they wanted to build. Now, in 1854, you have the Crimean War. So this is when Nicholas, who is the Tsar at the time, he dies around that period, and then Russia is humiliated because Russia is still very primitive in the technological sense. It doesn't have railway, it doesn't have and it is landlocked. So if it's attacked by Turks, and Turks have a border with they have a sea, they have a Black Sea, so they have a naval fleet. Of course, it's interesting. Catherine actually sent because Turkey was attacking from the Black Sea, from the Mediterranean, and this is an aside to go back a little bit, she sent from Petersburg, which was built by Peter, she sent half the fleet via going, through the Baltic Sea and then to the north of Europe, down south through the the Straits of Gibraltar to the Mediterranean, surprised Turkey and won that war. That was Catherine the Great. Of course, she had other advisors also. But when Nicholas was, going to war, that was by the time, of course, Alexander II also comes into the picture. But Russia loses the war badly because they have low technology for warfare, and their logistics is very poor. People walk. The soldiers were made to walk. They served peasant workers. Soldiers. They were made to walk, and of course they lost a huge number of people. They lost, and it was a humiliation for them. So theatre artists and plays. So when Alexander looks at this, he sees that now is the time to begin to reform. So he actually reforms the economic, social, political, cultural life of the Russians. He abolishes serfdom, 1861. It's a very important. Of course, Alexander is still very controversial because although he does a lot of these, but he also begins to, press down very heavily on the people at a later stage. We don't have time for that. So theatre artists, playwrights and critics flourish. Magazines flourish. There's something called the Contemporary, Savremennik, which is published around this time, and it's very, very popular. And in Tolstoy writes to it, and so many other writers whose names we are familiar with, they are writing. Now, what does this? Quickly lifts restrictions on universities. So science is flourishing. So he relaxes censorship. So new journals come up. You see, the tone of journals also, they are more critical than previously. Newspapers, magazines. Then there is this intelligentsia I talked to you about. Intelligentsia seek to understand what social conditions go to produce the ignorance. Now, sociology. Okay? Sociology. Why is it people are motivated? What prevents the ordinary, simple Russian serf and peasant to be so ignorant, so superstitious, and cruel in their own ways, in their immediate surroundings? They're not liberated from the thoughts of vengeance and small, low-level thoughts. So in the lowest classes of Russian society, they're actually looking at, among other things, I'm just highlighting some of these things because these are important to understand a particular society. Now, very importantly, the role of science, because science is reintroduced in the schools, in the secondary schools, in the curriculum. So what happens is there is a public interest slowly. This is again all urban areas. It's still rural Russia is still far away. Public interest in scientific thought, really begins to flourish, explode. Psychophysiology begins to be applied to art, literature, and theatre. I'll tell you why. It's very interesting. At this time, we have all heard of Ivan Pavlov, the condition of force. Now, even before Ivan Pavlov, there was this also an Ivan Sechenov, who was known for he was looking at the physiology, the motivations. For example, when I act, I'm seen to act in the sense that I am behaving. There are things that are happening to my muscles, whether it's facial muscles, bodily muscles, skeletal muscles. I'm doing something. There is some motivation taking place inside me. So this is psychophysiological. So when I'm acting, when I'm doing anything at all, when I'm behaving in a particular way, I'm prompted by a particular socio-physiological consideration that is making me do what it is. Okay. So what does Sechenov do? He and Ivan Pavlov, he comes much later. In fact, Pavlov recognizes Sechenov as a founding father of psychology, theoretical psychology. Although, of course, much later in the 70s of 1870s, 1880s, there is this Wilhelm Wundt of Leipzig in Germany, who begins to look at behavior, psychological behavior through experiment. He begins to experimentally understand the motivations of people. So that is an experimental psychological stream. Now you have Sechenov who he actually prefigures this entire stream of thinking. So it's very interesting because Sechenov's, there's a treatise written by Sechenov. It's called The Reflexes of the Brain. See, you must remember that the brain wasn't really well understood at the time. Brain begins to the identification of the nerve comes very much towards the end of the century, turn of the century, that is 19th century, late 1800s to early 1900s. This Cajal, he's a Spanish doctor who writes, who identifies nerve, and he stains it. He sees this is the structure of the nerve. So even much before, so whatever material they had, he was able to bring, and he says, based on the scanty physiological facts then known about the functions of the nervous system. So this is very important. How this begins to appeal to Stanislavski. See, we will talk about a little bit about Stanislavski now that we have given some kind of a background to what was the scientific thinking. So instead of, idealism says that God, transcendence, the metaphysics or way of, so I'm inspired by something, I'm guided by God, I'm guided by some forces which I cannot understand, which could be also all right in the sense that they serve other functions, but to actually look for a motivation for people, to understand why people behave in the ways they do, to place this on a scientific footing. However, the science might be not entirely correct, but still it's a new way of looking at things, and that's a very interesting thing that happened in this particular epoch in Russia. Now, 40 years after the publication of Reflexes of the Brain, Pavlov applied it to the study of psychic phenomena in the dog, and that's how you get the physiological method of conditioned reflex. Okay? So Pavlov, of course, called Sechenov father of psychology. Now, there was someone interesting man called Boborkin, P.D. Boborkin, who applies Sechenov's ideas, his psychophysiological ideas, to the stage. So he says, Russian actors are seeking truth in a sort of mystical metaphysics of the soul. He argues that connections between external stimuli, muscular reflexes, and complex human emotion can make for a pseudo or naive materialist theory of acting. So it's a naive materialist theory of acting, you might call it that, because it is not materialist, because you cannot say this causes this. When I have a million thoughts, but one thought of mine will result in some particular action. But the fact that I'm thinking and therefore I'm acting is a kind of basis, a material basis, because my brain is a material basis. So that way, this whole thing begins to get founded. Now, the soul, after all, cannot be observed or investigated, whereas muscular contractions are not behavior. Because in later years in the United States, it becomes behaviorism, P.F. Skinner and other people. So that's quite an interesting thing in itself. But you can see how these were. So that Boborkin brought it to stage. Now, let us very quickly talk about theory. Probably have another couple of 3 or 4 minutes to go. I will try and summarize it as quickly as I can. This is Stanislavski, Konstantin Stanislavski. So what it does is, he has an enormous influence on the way acting is theorized. Although, of course, he was not very clear as to what he was saying. He began to sort of look at his own work right till the end of his years, and wasn't so. But basically, one is that there is something called presentational acting, and secondly, there's something called experiential acting. Now, what he says, when an actor has a psychology, an actor has a mind, which is making him what he is. But when he's playing a character, the actor is trying to get into the mind of the character, motivations of the character. And to understand the motivations of the character, the actor must understand the entire background. It is not just one simple character taken away from, sort of abstracted from a context. So understanding a context, which means that the actor and the character they come. So it's called this. It is coming together. It's called this blizhenia. In Russia, it means coming together, blending into one. And of course, when you blend into one, and you act on the basis of a knowledge of the character's motivations, then that is your system of acting. I mean, there is no system. I'm not talking about the system or method of acting, that he was later on believed to have propounded when he went to the United States. I mean, it's actually a lot of the actors in Hollywood, they talk about Stanislavski as having been inspired by Stanislavski. So now, what I'm saying here is that Stanislavski was also inspired by the kind of thinking that was taking place in that particular period. Okay, so now what happens is, very quickly, this perejivania, the understanding of experientialist, there's a word called perejivania in Russian, which means to live the experience. It also means to undergo, to endure, to relive an experience. Also, very importantly, a way of experiencing unfavorable conditions. There is a kind of pejorative sense to perejivania. Perejit means I'm sort of recalling something which is not entirely present. See, so there is a kind of a hint of some discomfort. So that discomfort allows us to reflect much better on what it is that the character wants to say, or what character is motivated by. So this is something very, very important. Okay, now the genuine penetration of a psychic state is represented in a represented character. This is what the experiential theatre talks about. If I have another 5 minutes, then I will try and talk about the influence of Now, Stanislavski says that when an actor experiences a role, the fully realized personality of the character so dominates the occasion that the actor's own personality virtually disappears. Now, I mean, as a theatre practitioner myself, I've had many people asking me about Stanislavski and Brecht. Unfortunately, I don't know whether I will be able to have the time to discuss Brecht, but let me place together these two. See, you have a psychology, a kind of becoming completely character oriented. So it is presentational, experiential. But in the case of Brecht, which is used much later in the late Soviet period, you have people like Mikhail Shatrov, who use Brechtian techniques to say that, look here, I'm an actor, but I come from the same roots as you, the audience. I would like to say that I'm playing a particular role, but I'm showing you this role as someone having the psychology of one of you among the audience, and showing this is the kind of showing. It's showing what society is all about. So therefore, I'm not trying to become immersed or absorbed in the plot, but I'm trying to throw open the plot, throw open the contradictions, the kind of cruelties, the violence that is there in my being a role. See, when I'm acting a character, there is a violence I'm doing to myself, my understanding of reality. So when Brecht talks about epic theatre, of course this is not directly involved, but it does come. But just give me a minute. I will ask Jyoti whether I can take another 10 minutes to complete this. Please bide with me when I make this call. I apologize. She is not on the call, so I will, until I am asked to stop, I will continue. Thank you.
Hello.
Jyoti ಅವರೇ, ಇನ್ನೊಂದು 5 ನಿಮಿಷ ನನಗೆ ಸಿಗತ್ತಾ? 5-10 ನಿಮಿಷ?
ಹೌದು ಸರ್, ಮಾತಾಡಿ ಸರ್, ಮಾತಾಡಿ.
ಏನು ಅಡ್ಡಿ ಇಲ್ಲ ತಾನೆ? ನೀವು ನನಗೆ 1 ಗಂಟೆ ಕಾಲ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ರಿ, ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಅದಷ್ಟು ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ.
ಮಾತಾಡಿ, ಏನು ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಇಲ್ಲ ಸರ್, ಮಾತಾಡಿ.
ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ಸೋ ಮಚ್. So I have been given an extra lease on time, so I'll try to make best use of it. So now let me go to the place that I had decided on. Now, so what is Stanislavski talking about? He says there's something called an actor's psyche. The surest means to this end comes when the actor learns how to align his psyche with the imagined psyche of the dramatic character. For then, an authentically organic process of creation can happen. Now, the artist needs to prepare in the same manner. So, there is this famous work of Stanislavski for the artist to prepare. So the artist needs to prepare in the same manner, humbly. Andre, one who is able to receive the lineaments, the kind of character descriptions that there are in the character he is playing, painstakingly and rigorously, like would a great concert artist. Suppose I am going to perform any great concert artist you can think of, say Bhimsen Joshi or Mallikarjun Mansoor, Gangubai Hanagal, Kishori Amonkar. These are great concert artists. They performed also. I mean, they were great theorists. I mean, Kishori Amonkar was a great explorer of music, but she was also a great concert artist. What is the kind of preparation these people did? That is the kind of preparation one needs to make in becoming, in going to act, to play out a character. Now, he also says, seek feelings in you that are analogous to the feelings of the character. That will manifest the human spiritual life of the role. Of course, there is an assumption here of the empathy, the kind of empathy that we are able to feel. Because without empathy, we are not able to understand a character. What is the interpretation we have to construct the character. According to Stanislavski, you have to construct the character. And how do you do that? By actually going very deeply to understand the analogies of the life situation that a particular character has been into. Therefore, come very close to what he calls the human spiritual life. Human spiritual life of the world. It's not just mouthing some words which a character says. You see? So this is the important thing that Stanislavski is talking about. And another very, very important thing which allows us to understand the character is what Stanislavski calls as the subtext. He may not have worded it in this manner, but there is the subtext is that when we are talking, let us say, I'll give you an example of a subtext. I am saying something, but the manner of my saying it, the way I pause, the kind of language that I use, you see, am I being respectful? Am I being sarcastic? Am I being, very deferential? Or, humbling myself, making myself into some kind of a lowly creature? What am I? So, apart from, there is a verbal rendering, there is the word, and there is a subtext. The subtext is not only at the moment of being expressed, but there is a subtext that runs through the entire relationship that is evolving between characters, among characters, within a setting. The setting is that of the drama itself, the dramatic material as given to us by the writer, the player. So this approach could be achieved only with the help of the subtext. That's what Stanislavski says. For him, subtext is not the obvious, but the inner sense of the role's human spiritual life. We've already talked about human spiritual life, which flows continuously under the words of the text. Continuously. The subtext is a subterranean sense that you see. For example, you are with someone. Sometimes you're very comfortable most of the time, but there is something that says, oh, something is not all right here. Am I able to really understand this person, or am I just going by the kind of the words that you're using. Okay? So the subtext is something which is beyond that. So one has to become sensitive to understand the subtext. So always justifying and vivifying things. So you say which flows continuously under the words of the text, always justifying and vivifying them. That is bringing them to life, giving them a new life of their own. An interplay will occur between the text and the subtext as the actor finds means to illustrate the subtext. See, it is not simply it's not just empathy alone. It is, for example, not only the context of the play itself, the words of the play, of the dramatist, the playwright, but what is the kind of creation your fellow actor is bringing to the stage. See, there is a subtext of the interpretation of the fellow actor also. See, entire, and the kind of interpretation that has been given by the director and the fellow actors, and what is the interpretation, what kind of contexts have been set by the stage directors. You see, so everything is, their subtext comes from so many different fields. If you have a bright day and if you have a dark day, the mood is very, very different. So the brightness of the stage, the darkness of the stage can also form part of the subtext. One has to be, so I'm trying to interpret this further from what Stanislavski seems to suggest. This is very, very important for an actor, and for life itself, to understand people, to understand the motivations of people. In politics also, I mean, we have seen that the world of politics seems to, there's a lot of claim being made. Words. So our words, finally, if their words are represented to you through the media, what are these words? What is the tone in which these are said? What is the subtext? What is the agenda? What is the motivation? I think it is important. So even in understanding the political realities of, in contemporary political realities, one can, benefit from understanding Stanislavski. So why is it so important to understand realism? Now, we talked about earlier, it's about 15 minutes earlier, about this Sechenov and Pavlov. So they were in a situation where you have this French sociologist. I mean, we can call him sociologist now, although that word, I think he also he didn't, I'm not sure if he coined that word, but Auguste Comte, or Comte, I don't know how you pronounce it in French, but this, he was he's considered as one of the important founders of sociology. Now, what does he say? What does Comte say? He says, founder of sociology, he demanded that metaphysical explanations of events and behavior be abandoned in favor of material explanations based in observation and analysis, which exactly what we were talking about in Sechenov, although he was talking about looking at the psychophysiological, so like what happens when you see like the muscles, if I deploy my muscles in particular way, body postures, the body language and my thoughts. So he is talking about how idealism, that is what is happening in my mind. Or let us say, if I say God, if I say if I claim the soul, how do I demonstrate that there is a soul? I mean, just to go back several hundred years ago in India, you had a king. I mean, I don't remember the name of this king, but the episode, the anecdote is interesting about whether there is transmigration of souls or reincarnation. Okay? Now, suppose when a person dies, does the person get reincarnated in some other being? Of course, there is in the Jain tradition, and Buddhist Jataka tales talk about migration, and many of the practices of Buddhism, the person is very seriously passing on. They invoke a new life, so there are therapeutic reasons why people use transmigration or reincarnation. But there was a king. Of course, he would go to war, and he told his soldiers, "We'll be going to battle today, and many years, and if you happen to die." Of course, he didn't say that if he happened to die, what would happen. But anyway, see, he was a king, so he said, "If you happen to die, please let me know. Come and tell me that you were born somewhere else." It's a transmigration of soul. And over 30 years or 40 years of his being a king and in many battles, no one came and told him. So one day he said, "I'm sorry, I don't really believe in this, because no one has come and told me." And several of my soldiers, unfortunately, have passed on, died in battle. If they were born, they would come and tell me. So similarly, so as a metaphysical explanations of events and behavior be abandoned in favor of material explanation. So this is what I mean. It's a crude. That's why I call it naive material, not crude, naive material theory. It's not materialist. Because of this happens. That's a kind of naive material relation between cause and effect. Now, so French naturalists who are, you have a lot of people there who are thinking about many of these things in France and in England and other parts of the world. In Russia, we have already seen. French naturalists emphasized heredity and environment. Like Charles Darwin, talked about heredity and environment. So heredity is like passed on from one generation to another. The characteristics of an environment. Suppose I am able to have particular features which will help me survive and thrive in this life. I will pass it on to my next generation. So that is what is crudely called as survival of the fittest. I mean, it's a very, very wrong way of putting it. But anyway, that's how it is. It led to, of course, social Darwinism, because this kind of phraseology leads to some kind of negative effects. The social Darwinism comes from this kind of a description of environmental influences on the human, on the species. Okay. So coming back here, so this idea was grounded in, in Charles Darwin's evolution. So human behavior viewed as a product of hereditary and environmental forces came to be seen as being determined by factors largely beyond any individual's control. A certain kind of thing that, at that time, of course today the thinking is very different. Let me also say that, because today this is the whole nature versus nurture debate. So about 50 years ago, I was told, and I believe, that 95% of my genes decide what I'm going to be. It's a kind of genetic fatalism. Genetically I'm going to be this. It's a kind of fatalism, because this is how I'm genetically made. But increasingly today, it's like 95%. It's my environment, including the development of my brain, the plasticity of my brain. That is the environment, the kind of auto feedback of my thoughts, what I'm going to tell myself. That is going to determine what consequences they will have for me or for a society. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. Things are different. But at the time, yes, it was still believed that environmental factors had largely the genetic factors outplayed. Okay. Now let's very quickly talk about the Moscow Art Theatre, which we have already seen how. Nemirovich Danchenko and of course Vladimir Nemirovich Danchenko and Stanislavski together founded the Moscow Art Theatre, which is known for its where Stanislavski experimented with a lot of ways of training actors. And Stanislavski is very interesting because in his home, when he was small, he had a lot of people, clowns coming, and this is Kamaroki that we talked about, similar things, people coming, entertaining the children in various ways, and later on he actually began to act, and he learnt a lot, and then he began to realize that this acting whole thing is slapdash thing, it's slapstick kind of thing, does not bring into play thinking about a mind at all. See, this whole idea of the mind, theory of the mind, is so important, because when I know that something has a mind, let us say, if you say The tree has a mind, it doesn't have a mind. An animal doesn't have a mind. Your relationship with those entities, those objects, are quite different from when you say something has a mind. Unfortunately, of course, this is being very anthropocentric. But for the present consideration, a theory of mind is very important. Just look at human species. If you say that same kind of mind, the kind of thoughts that I am able to entertain because of the nature of the mind which I share, the brain that I share evolutionarily, is the same kind of mind that anyone outside there in the society. However good, however bad, we share this faculty of mind. So this is a theory of the mind. So to understand, the empathy of course comes from there. Empathy comes from mimesis and so many other things which will not come from. Mimesis is important, but I don't think I'm going to talk about it today because that will take us into a completely different domain altogether. So maybe some other context we probably want to be able to know. Okay, so Chekhov he brought in, and Chekhov was disappointed because his sequel, he had had this first play which was performed, I think, in St. Petersburg, Alexandria Theatre. It was not received well. People were very unhappy with it. So that was the time Stanislavski brought him back. And Chekhov was a great writer, great human being. He was truly a doctor who wanted to help people. He was suffering from tuberculosis, right? Congenitally almost. But yet he was a great human being. And so that was the kind of situation he was in. And you can see that the entire Chekhovian writing, the realism that there is mentioned. Of course, Chekhov is also called a very person with a very negative kind of a pessimistic view of the world. Of course, we will not go into that because that is not what we, as I said, it's not a promise, because then we have to look at each of those works and then finally come to conclusion. But you see, this always open. These questions are for as a critical question. They are always open. So anyway, Stanislavski gave a lot of. Chekhov wrote for them, and also mutually they reinforced their belief in theatre by this collaboration. Now, in post, then of course you have there's something called agit-prop, propaganda. After the Soviet coming into this post-revolution, theatre was very important because it was important to drive home the ideas of a new society. It was post-revolutionary society. Revolution had taken away the old part, but it had not yet brought in the new. But they were exploring, and in fact, the kind of experimentation that the Soviet Union has done is enormous. Both positive ones. Unfortunately, we know of the negative ones. Definitely terrible deeds were done by people like Stalin, and he left a kind of trail of people executed, sent to exile. It's very true. And the whole idea of a revolution is fraught with structural violence. There is structural violence in this. But when two opposing forces come together and there is no negotiation, see, this is what happens. You look at Russian society or any society where there is no negotiation, where there is no opening oneself to the possibilities of another being aggrieved, and looking at what is it that is causing the aggrievement. That negotiation on terms can perhaps allow for a lot of humane evolution of society, but unfortunately that didn't happen and is not happening, and there is much we can learn from it. We don't have to repeat those things. Like today's situation, people can negotiate. When you do not negotiate, that is when structurally violence becomes alive. Violence comes alive when there is a refusal to negotiate, and this is something one needs to keep in mind. So this happened. So theatrically, agitation and propaganda. So that was an important phase in which they used theatre instrumentally. It's an instrumental use of theatre, and of course, as I said, during Stalin there was not much of creative theatre because most of it was used this way, and a lot of the writers who were saying things that were, because that was a period when you wanted to look at a new society. There were a lot of writers who were looking at a new form of society and being critical. When you want to look at a new society, you are going to be critical of the society as it is at that moment. And it was in a ferment for about 20 years when we had all this collectivization. How do you collectivize? How do you bring in new nationalities to the mainstream? You see, the nominalism that everyone coexists and there is something. So the development of the structures that are required to bring in so many different nationalities, ethnicities, linguistic groups, religious groups, the entire Central Asian belt. You had people who were following Islam, and then there were other Catholics, there were other denominations even within the Christian, larger Christian stream. So, and those non-believers, there's so many different. It's a very, very difficult thing. But of course, unfortunately, those voices were suppressed, and violence won the day. It won the day. Stalin, of course, is remembered as in his. But what happened after Stalin, of course, is there was definitely a thaw, and there was a reflection on what had gone wrong. So in this particular period, 45 to see, this is till war. Of course, you had the major war. Russia was less than 20 years old. 1917 to 1922, you had the Civil War. You had the so-called White Russians, and which means basically those who were supporting the old order. And then you had the kulaks, not the kulaks, the peasants, and then you had the Red Army. There was a lot of violence there too. There's a lot of violence. It's like, if you go back to read Dostoevsky, there is this whole thing called nihilism. Nihilism is when you think that by destroying an old order, you will create a new order. It's a belief. But it's like there is a character in Possessed. He says that, give me 1 million heads and I will give you a new society. Such a thing really doesn't happen, right? We have had this. We have had so many millions of lives that have been sacrificed because of these ideas. Whether it in Soviet Union or in China, during the Cultural Revolution. Then you had the Pol Pot's regime for 1 million lives must have been taken. If you look at it that way, look at the irony of history. But history doesn't really. It was ironical. Dostoevsky was being ironical. You can't create a new order just by destroying an old order. See? So anyway, this is something that one needs to keep in mind, that those 20 years towards the war were extremely difficult in all senses, and it was still very unstable, and you had Stalin putting his iron foot down on everything. A lot of creativity was destroyed. Then between 45 and 68, 45 I'm using just post-war. Stalin died in 53, so until then things were really bad. But post-war, there was, you had censorship, you had a lot of other things which were very strictly. So you had to be promoting the socialist ideals, you had to be saying good things about Stalin and all the political apparatchiks. Okay, so that was the period. And then after that, then you had Khrushchev. That is when you have this so-called thaw. It was definitely for about 10 to 12 years. Definitely things were different there. It was relaxed. A lot of things were relaxed. So, and Khrushchev denounced Stalin formally, and he said that in 56, 2 years after Stalin was dead. Now, in so 1968 to late 80s, you've had Soviet theater that enjoys popularity which is unsurpassed in the world. So those are about 20-30 years. You have something like 30 theaters filled to the brim every night in Moscow. 30 theaters, drama theaters, not talking about kino theaters, cinema theaters. Okay, 110 million people attend more than 600 professional theaters. Okay, and 60 theaters devoted to children and youth alone. I mean, these are some of the figures I thought I will share with you, because they will give you an idea of when we say people don't come and watch plays, which is a complaint of all theatre practitioners. This is something one can be very envious of. Okay. Anyway, so the thought time, what happens is you have the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in 1956. That is when Nikita Khrushchev announces the personality cult and dictatorship is started. And the period that comes after this is known as Khrushchev's thaw. Thaw is like the snow melts, and that's also important because thaw is something that all Russians look forward to, because from October onwards almost till end of April, it is snowbound. The entire northern, it is 66 degrees. Moscow is actually located at around 66 degrees north latitude. Okay, which is the Arctic Circle, and there's nothing to prevent the cold Arctic winds coming in. So it's very, very cold, frozen, -20, -30, -35, 40. It's quite ordinary. So when you say thaw, it is the spring. So it is also metaphorically very true that there's a thaw in the whole way in which they were looking at their own society as well as theatre in that sense. Okay. So this openness, of course, you had this, as I already told you this, you have this Moscow's Savremennik was a magazine. Now you have a Savremennik theatre, that is contemporary theatre, and Taganka theatre. These two I would like to mention specifically because they did a lot of experimentation within the possibilities of the Soviet system. Okay. Now these two became, let me repeat it, Moscow contemporary theatre, if you want it in translation. Otherwise, in Russian it will be Savremennik. Savremennik means sa, vremya is time, sa is together, one who shares the same time. Contemporary. So there also con is together and tempora is time, so contemporary. It's the same kind of way in which these are defined. So Moscow Savremennik theatre and Taganka theatre, because it is located still there in a square called Taganka Square in Moscow. So these two did a lot of interesting work. For example, their productions sought to get rid of dogma, because dogma, you see that dogma was so strong in post-Soviet, early part of the Soviet Union, the kind of social political life that there was, like stereotypes, okay, and the tendency to mythologize history. So you always mythologize. You invent one person from the past, one idea from the past, and say this is the thing that we are today. And for example, I don't have to go very far. We do the same thing. Like we have Sanatana Dharma that becomes. But what is Sanatana? What is it made of? When you begin to zoom down, as we do today, zooming down, when you look at all the hierarchies, the structures, the way in which our societies come up. I've been recently working on a translation of the Dalit literature. The kind of lives our own in Karnataka, and of course some of the wonderful things that the king, for example, Nalvadi, Krishnaraj Wadiyar, Chamaraj Wadiyar, and Vivekananda. We know very little about how Vivekananda actually came to Mysore, and he told the Raja, king, if you do not take up any work on behalf of the Dalits, who are called Panchamas and they lived miserable lives, if you don't do it, I will not come and be a part of anything that you do. No, he almost like, how do you say? There's a particular term which escapes. Anyway, so he made it a point that you come, you do this, I will come, I will support. Okay. So what I'm saying is that when you look at the past. So mythologizing the past. And now here I think I should mention Brecht, because Brecht's epic theatre. And we all talk about epic theatre. What does he actually mean by it? Whether he says something about it or not, what does he actually mean? Is that there is a way, because the way he writes his plays, whether it's Mother Courage, is someone who's only looking at the present. She has to survive. She has to survive. And how does she survive? She survives by looking at, see, in Mother Courage is happening when, the Catholics and the Protestants are, they're fighting together in 15th century or 16th century Europe, Sweden. So Mother Courage is in that war zone, and she's actually taking soldiers, dead soldiers, belts, caps, various canteens, things, and selling and making a life, living out of that. So what is that? He says epic. We talk of an epic because that epic doesn't have any value for you today. Traditions they always change. Traditions, they change. But you want to bring in a past tradition as valid today in order to score a point and to make a political statement out of that. But ordinary people live on the basis of negotiation, give and take. So this is something one must remember when we do Brecht. Okay, we use alienation and epic theatre in very loose and almost without really understand, but this is what is meant. So today when we do, for example, what is again important about Brecht is that when a situation changes, so does the value of a past order. That past order, whatever traditions it dictated, may not be valid in the order that comes about, because we have worked towards creating that order. But within that order, there are going to be hegemonies, and one has to be always alert to hegemony. One must be vigilant to protect against hegemonies and to protect the values of democracy. This is something we need to keep in mind. Okay, let's move forward. So what happened? The Taganka theatre showed the influence of Bertolt Brecht. That's why the reason I spoke about the aesthetic of Bertolt Brecht is the estrangement or alienation of it. Coming back to Stanislavski getting into the character, empathy, understanding of the motivations. Brecht separating, I am an actor and I am part of society which I am putting forth before you. I am conscious of putting forth this particular character for you to understand, analyze and receive whatever messages may be had both by the text and the subtext. This is a very important thing that we need to keep in mind. Okay, and then actors exhorted to examine their characters from outside the play itself. See, this is again that. Outside the play. I am looking at myself outside the play. If I am playing a waitress or a waiter in a restaurant, okay, in the play. Now I have to imagine myself as being a waitress out there, and I must also imagine, suppose let us say I am a teacher, I am a scholar. Okay, so what is my understanding? In Stanislavski, I will have that zbliżenie, the coming together, blending of the characters, blending of psychology. But in Brecht, it is the sharpening of the psychology, sharpening of the difference. So therefore, see, this estrangement effect is alienating because it sharpens and says that this character I'm playing this character, but you must understand that I know that I am different. My social realities, my socio-political realities, economic realities are different from the realities of the role I'm playing. So this is a very significant difference one needs to keep between Stanislavski and Brecht. And see, it is being played out here. See, Brecht. They're not talking about Stanislavski anymore. They're talking about Brecht. So then actors exhorted. So actors create a bridge between the public audience, that is the reality, and themselves, the alienated reality. So this is something. So alienation is this. But I have been alienated. See, there is a word, alienation has many meanings, connotations. So you alienate a piece of land, you sell it. Okay. So when I alienate myself, I'm going away from a group and becoming part of another group. So I'm coming out of the audience to alienate myself into a character. So these are some of the interesting. I leave it to you to reflect on it. I mean, I'm not giving you a final lecture on this. I'm just sharing these thoughts with you. Okay. Now, so let us look at one or two contemporary accounts of what happens when these, there's something called production theatre. It's very important. We have not really heard so much about this production theatre in the Soviet Union, especially in the Khrushchev-Thaw period and during the period in which Brezhnev was the general secretary. Okay, now this production theatre was because the economy was terrible. The ways in which they were actually going about the production process in a factory, in the economy of the larger, like you have a supply chain, you have production, you have a supply chain, you have a consumption, it's all. Then there are retails, there are wholesalers, and there are people who buy and who, so there is a money economy, there is a production economy, there is a sharing, the way in which the logistics works, transport logistics, how much should be sourced, how much should not be sourced. I mean, inventories, all these are purely economic considerations. Now there's a production theatre. So in that production theatre, they began to actually examine how things were being done and criticizing through theatre actually the ways in which these managers were functioning purely as bureaucrats, purely as technocrats, purely not having an understanding, not responding to the needs of the current, of the present times, contemporary times, contemporary pressures. So this is what the production theatre was all about. There is this lady, I have a bibliography at the bottom. I can share, I think it is there in the PDF that I shared with Jyoti Dikshit. So those who are interested can definitely have this bibliography. So there is this theatre artist as well as critic, writer called Vera Shamina. She recalls, she's part of this. There was a censors, so she was part of the censor. In the sense, she would go and visit when a censor was, censor committee would watch a play and say, okay, change this, change that, don't do this, that kind of thing. So censor was very active in the Brezhnev period. That's about, say, between the early 70s and the early 80s, about 10 to 12 years after the Khrushchev period. Now, what she says, so she recalls attending the production of 10 Days That Shook the World. This 10 Days That Shook the World was written by John Reed, an American journalist, who was present in St. Petersburg when the revolution, within quotes revolution, because it was called the October Revolution. And although it's much longer, those 10 days were very, very important, crucial for the change in which, from the Tsar abdicated about, it's called the February Revolution, Fevralsky Revolution. So the Tsar, Nicholas II, abdicated. He said, okay, I will let this be, I'll be Tsar no more. So there was a provisional government. Now the provisional government, then there was a second time when you had the Fevralskaya Revolution. So that was when you had, between that and the October's revolution. So you had 6 months when the provisional government, which was actually nobles and the industrialists and merchants who were just, who were very close to the Tsar, but they continued. But the workers and peasants and led by the various revolutionary parties, Lenin of course was the leader, Ulyanov was the leader, and those days when you had this revolution taking place, when the provisional government was also overthrown, and Lenin came from Germany to Sweden and Finland, and then he came to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, and then he led the entire revolution. It was a very, very important figure. So those 10 days are recorded by this. So they actually reenact those 10 days. And what is interesting is not just the reenactment. What is the spirit in which they reenacted? they subject Lenin to a trial. See, this director and writer called Mikhail Shatrov, I will come to that. So, just quickly summing up the what she says here is, what I say, sorry, what not Vera Shamina says. Thought did not last long. Okay, this is when, like I said, the Brezhnev comes in, and you have removal of Khrushchev from his post, mark a new historical period, which is called the stagnation period. So stagnation period in every sense, politically stagnation, economically, industrially. So therefore, that is why the production theatre comes in, where they were trying to use production theatre to actually look at why these things were happening. And that is when the censorship became very ruthless. It was cutting up plays and banning many of them. Okay. Now, so censor in Brezhnev's time, for example, each new play was strictly revised by the censors before it could appear on stage. After all the corrections were made, the censors say, okay, do this, you don't use that word, don't use this word, and cuts were made. The show was presented for approval to a special commission comprising the members of local party authorities and the Ministry of Culture. These are things that persist through so many societies. Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, Ministry of Culture, all these, what is the kind of role they play, especially when people are trying to say this is not right, that is not right. So this is one of those things. So directors had to fight for each production. And when a show was presented to the commission for acceptance, members of the commission could at any point say freeze. Like you say, in a film you can say freeze and go back. But here the theatre is in progress, and no theatre is, at least in its standard way, the theatre continues from point A to point B. It doesn't stop and go back unless it is part of the structure of the play. Okay. Now you say freeze and then go back and change it and do it again. So change the course of action. It's like in interactive theatre, you say today in Bangalore there are many people who do interactive theatre. Say, okay, this is a scenario. Now how would you have done it? How would these actors, if you are an actor in the sense, if you are an agent, part of the whole scene, and you ask the audience, how would you do it? So they'll come with various new ideas. So that is the kind of freeze that the censors want. So what Vera Shamina says is, here is an eyewitness account by this Vera Shamina. So she says, during the presentation of the play, Dear Elena Sergeyevna. So this is the name of the play. Dear Elena Sergeyevna is the name of the play. By the author's name is Lyudmila Razumovskaya. Okay, at Kazan Drama Theatre. Kazan is another place, has a very good, very interesting history, theatre history. The members of the Quality Control Commission demanded to change the final scene when the protagonist, a teacher, driven by her students to despair, commits suicide. Students are very unruly and not listening to her, she commits suicide. So the play ended happily within quotes. So because the censors wanted to end happily with the heroine pulling herself together and going to work. So instead of the teacher committing suicide, she said, okay, then she's very happy, she goes back to work. That's what the censors wanted. So that is according to the logic of the party authorities. Social duty should always take the upper hand over personal feelings. The production was banned anyway. See? So when in reality, suppose a farmer is committing suicide and you want to actually bring it up on stage, if there were censors of this kind, I'm sure there are many censors of this kind in our country as well. We are not alienated from this kind of culture. So you say, why? Not all farmers are like this. So why don't you see that there is a happy ending? So this is real, something we reflect on. Okay, and then I already spoke to you about this production drama. There's a kind of drama that evolved during the period of stagnation. And the protagonist of these production dramas was often a young, energetic, enterprising man who did not want to live in the old way. See, old, within quotes, Soviet way. But instead rejected the undeserved bonuses, because a lot of people were paying themselves bonuses okay, although they didn't do any work, told the truth of his employers and struggled with the bureaucracy. So suppose you come up, you have all these whistleblowers or social activists who say this is not right in this society. What you do, you have to struggle with the bureaucracy. And what does the bureaucracy do? You know. So this is the kind of production drama that had performances turned into a meeting with the participation of the audience. Okay, audience was participating. Most burning economic problems, issues they dared not articulate in their own collectives. Collectives in the sense local collectives where you had a party representative taking care of what you're supposed to think and what you're supposed to eat, what you're supposed to do, whom you're supposed to marry, all that kind of thing. You know, all familiar scenes. Okay, were discussed. Production drama could not, however, meet the hopes pinned on it. It was unfortunately because of the censors, because of various people, problems remained insoluble. You could not be just suggested here and not taken up and used in actual implementation. Okay, so the conflict of the play itself remained open-ended. So this is something that we need to. And again, I very briefly talk about Michael Shatrov, I think. Events covering the events of 1917. I told you about the October Revolution. Early years of Soviet rule, they were subject to severe analysis. This Shatrov subjected them very closely. He wrote plays about Lenin and the Bolsheviks as well as Stalin's show trials. You know, you already decide that someone is guilty. You know, someone is guilty, so you just have a mock trial and then either imprison him or finish him off or execute him for anti-Soviet whatever. He portrayed them as common people. Suppose Lenin and Stalin and these Bolsheviks are common people with strong and weak points. They have the strong points, weak points. How would they look? Like if we subject them that these are not heroes. I mean, our leaders are not necessarily heroes. They are like you and me, good and bad. Thoda sa नेक हूँ, थोड़ा बेईमान हो. There's an old song. I remember that. दुनिया जो चाहे समझे मैं तो इंसान. That's a very old Muhammad Ali song. It's sort of here. So he did this kind of a thing. So he portrayed them as common people, having self-doubt, strong points, weak points, and articulated the mistakes they made. Lenin made mistakes, Stalin made mistakes, and the Bolsheviks made mistakes. What mistakes? If they had listened to the others saying that these are your mistakes, correct them because you are going to affect the entire society. So, but they didn't. So what happened? So therefore, of course, he uses Brecht very strongly. And production of these plays, of course, they have a distinct Brechtian aesthetics, direct appeal to the audiences, and they invite discussions and joint reflections with the audiences as they proceeded. And of course, this was all possible in the early late 80s because of Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev was the general secretary towards the end of the 80s, and he had these two words, glasnost and perestroika. It's very interesting because glasnost and perestroika were also used by Alexander I. So this is, historically they bring certain of these things. There is a continuity. Glasnost means transparency. Glasa means to see. Glass, for example, we have glass. It comes from the same cognate there. Same roots. So glasnost is transparency, and perestroika, to rebuild. Perestroika, okay? To rebuild. So rebuild an old society which is being terribly, built wrongly. Change things, but you obviously do not throw everything out like a nihilist does. You destroy the old order. See, that's why old is gone, but the new is yet to begin. That whole dilemma between the past and the future is always all being played out in Russia, in the Soviet Union. So then you have Shatrov's works were staged without the cuts or revisions imposed by censors in the past. So Shatrov was really Gorbachev made this possible. So he has this dictatorship of conscience where a group of journalists stage a mock trial of Lenin. So there's a group of journalists. Now it is the other way around. You have a mock trial of journalists themselves. You bring those journalists and say, put various labels on them and conduct a mock trial, which is happening in our country. Right? But it is just the opposite there. It says Lenin is being brought there, and you have a set of journalists and then they are subjected then into the kind of dictatorship of conscience. If you have a conscience, what will it dictate? So dictatorship, the conscience means going by the dictates of conscience. It's a kind of punning on the word. Okay, so while the revolutionary idealism as embodied in Lenin is affirmed, there was a revolution. Lenin really meant well. He said he wanted a new society. What kind? But the play implicitly attacks the sclerotic, cynical system of Brezhnev years and the malign, lingering influences of Stalin. Although there are some things which are new, Lenin was definitely good. But how do these terrible influences persist through a society? As it happened in, like the revisiting, the coming back of these values, Stalin's influences in nationalist period. So these were okay. So you have again these two. I have mentioned it in the bibliography, Tatiana Prokharova and Vera Shanin. You can find them on JSTOR. Very interesting articles. They were present in one such production of Moscow Lenkom theater, Leninsky Committee. Lenkom is Lenin's committee. Okay, in 1985. This is during Gorbachev's period. The improvisation led to, or maybe just before Gorbachev, led to dialogue with the spectators. Okay, this particular thing, play production. Shatrov raised the question: what is an individual? Okay, socially, politically, economically, we look at an individual differently, right? What is the individual's role in history? So individual has a present needs, individual needs, but those needs have been fulfilled within a larger framework of society. So what is his role? What is her role in society? And addressing the spectators directly, the actors would leave the stage and sit in the house. So initially they would start and they would prompt something, go back, sit with so that there is a continuity between, a continuum established between stage and audience. It's a kind of, you can look at it as a blending of Stanislavski and Brecht, bringing them together. It's Blizhenia, I use that word, blending these two interesting characters. One is a psychoanalytic, psychophysiological, and then one is the alienating. Then you bring them together and see what happens in reality. So this is what is happening. So in fact, at this particular meeting, Boris Yeltsin, who later on became president, and then he led various things against the, he was in a tank and all that. You all, many of you have seen it, and many of course, the millennials will not have seen it. But this man was present there in that particular, in 1985. He was there in that production, and he says, and the public, and he says, because it's like you have a microphone, and not a microphone, and being passed around to ask questions and interact. So when the microphone reaches Boris Yeltsin, the public had shouted, "Let him go onto the stage." So already by then you can see that Yeltsin had made his presence felt, literally in this case. And of course this is the beginning of interactive theatre, return of democracy. People had lost their ability to express their opinion freely and question the authorities for fear of being dubbed anti-Soviet and anti-people, and jailed and prosecuted. Interactive theatre allowed a private person, the individual with his or her personal opinion, to play an important role in democracy. So this is a very, very important thing, and we need to reflect on it as well. So therefore, theatre, what has theatre in Russia done that can be useful to us is that it has played an important social and political role as a stimulus for binding people together during crisis, instrumentally also, but binding people together, not dividing. It was also a mouthpiece of ideological dictatorship. Ideological dictatorship, as we looked at the building of the myth of the Russian Dusha, with spirit, soul, and Narod. Although of course they were all separate in reality, but when they were faced with Napoleon, they brought this together. Just like Mahabharata, you say that when there's some external force, Pandavas and Kauravas come together, otherwise they are separate. So the binding at particular moments in history then also served as a voice for forbidden truth. Like this whole Shastrov bringing in Lenin and subjecting them. So the fact that all leaders, all heroes are made up of both good and bad, and they are brittle also, not necessarily, and that they can make mistakes, and then they must be willing to take a look at themselves for society to make progress. And eventually it served as a didactic tool, as a learning tool in a school for democracy, teaching people to think and speak freely. And today, this whole thing is playing out on the streets of Russia, where one of the critics of the government is imprisoned, and people are asking for change. Now, this is what I have to say. It's been lengthy, much beyond the time that's been given to me. I hope